Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I can see the number of participants is growing. Let us get started. A very warm welcome to this webinar on getting targets right, how much tax can low-income countries raise. My name is Giulia Mascagni. I'm going to moderate the conversation today. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, and research director at the ictd, the International Center for Tax and Development. As we start, I'd like to remind everyone that we are recording and live streaming this conversation. And to the audience, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them in the discussion very shortly. So this topic of revenue increases and tax targets is particularly important against the background of shrinking fiscal space and spiraling debt levels and costs that we're hearing a lot about this week, in particular, as global leaders are gathered at the spring meetings to discuss these fiscal challenges, but also broader economic challenges. The main aim of the discussion today is to create a space for an independent conversation about tax and its central role in that broader fiscal challenge. The guiding question we are looking to tackle in the conversation is how much lower income countries can raise, and what is the role of tax targets to get there? In other words, how can we get tax targets right, not only to increase revenue to the level that is required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the level that is needed by the global challenges we're facing at the moment. So not only increases in revenue, but also increases that are achieved in a way that is equitable, sustainable, and efficient. I could not think of a better lineup of panelists to discuss this question than the one we have today. So let me start by introducing them alongside my colleagues from the ictd. Our first speaker will be Bernard Baimwera, who is the Dean of the Kenya School of Revenue Administration, KESRA, at the Kenya Revenue Authority. He was previously senior lecturer at Strathmore University, also in Kenya. We then have Doris Akol, who is a senior economist at the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. She previously served as the Commissioner General for the Uganda Revenue Authority until 2020. She's also the chair of the ictd's Central Advisory Group, and of course, she's been collaborating with us for quite some time. We have Kyle McNabb, who is a research associate and Uganda country lead in the Center for Tax Analysis in Developing Countries, TaxDev, which is a program of ODI and IFS. He was previously a research fellow at UNU-WIDER in Helsinki. Amina Ebrahim is a research fellow at UNU-WIDER. She's the focal point for tax policy research in the Domestic Revenue Mobilization Program. Her work is mostly focused around making administrative tax data available for research and in a way that is collaborative with African revenue administrations. Last but not least, we have Modeste Fatoing Mopa, who is the head of the TADAT Secretariat, also in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. He also has a very long experience in tax administration, not least as Director General of the Tax Administration in Cameroon for a decade up to 2023. So this is a wonderful lineup of speakers, and they are joined by my colleagues Max and Adrienne, who will kick off the discussion with a presentation based on a policy brief we have recently published at the ictd that will hopefully serve as a starting point for a broader discussion. So let me introduce them briefly as well. Adrienne is a doctoral fellow and Max is a research fellow and research lead, and they both work at IDS and the ictd with me. So without further ado, I would pass over to you, Max and Adi, for the initial presentation, and we will then hear perspectives and reflections from our panelists. There will be then a chance to ask questions and to have a bit of a discussion. So please do keep your questions flowing as you hear our panelists and presenters speaking in the next half an hour or so. Adi and Max, over to you.
Okay, great. So I'm going first, and I'm just going to put my screen share on. Just confirm, Giulia, that that's visible.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So the policy brief that Max, Giulia, and I all wrote is called "Getting Targets Right: How Much Revenue Can Lower Income Countries Raise?" And I'll just talk through some of the main points of that presentation, that policy brief. As Giulia already kind of anticipated with her opening remarks, tax plays a major role in financing development. And not only that, but it's also the most sustainable source of development financing. This graph is showing us a picture of overseas development assistance flows to sub-Saharan African countries, as well as non-resource tax revenues. And as you can see, we're moving from an aid era much more to a debt era. It's also clear that debt alone is not the answer to financing development, so tax plays a role even more than debt and aid. We also know that low-income countries work typically on less than half the budget of high-income countries, and our current tax collection is still insufficient, as Giulia also noted. A recent IMF paper estimated that low-income countries need to double their tax revenue by 2030, which is in 6 years, to make this substantial progress towards the SDGs. And tax ratios in high-income countries are on average 3 times higher than low-income countries. So there's a lot of pressure on low-income countries to quickly increase revenues. So how much revenue can they raise? Progress on revenue mobilization is often measured using tax-to-GDP ratios. And you see these ratios pop up in negotiations with donors, national development plans, medium-term revenue strategies, other sorts of policy documents written by governments. But there's also sort of a bunch of targets or tipping points that have been talked about in academic papers for a long time. So 15% tax-to-GDP ratio has been bandied about as a tipping point for functioning government, and other tax gaps or tax potential estimations has a long history in the economics literature. We see estimations ranging from 2 to 10 percentage points as the tax gap that low-income countries have, meaning that if they were to fully mobilize revenue, they would be able to increase by 2 to 10 percentage points. In a recent IMF paper, this sort of similar approach and estimated that a 9 percentage point increase in tax to GDP is feasible for low-income countries. But what we've seen in the data is that asking low-income countries to rapidly increase revenue is unrealistic. The history of revenue mobilization shows that sustaining even a 0.5 percentage point increase in tax to GDP each year is already very ambitious. And few countries have seen increases above 5 percentage points over a period of a few years. Often that's after post-conflict or a natural resource discovery related revenues. So it's also just not something that countries can do as a rule. Increases in tax GDP are also rarely linear and take time to accumulate. What we have here are 2 graphs from our paper. You can read more about them in the paper, but on the left-hand side, we have the average tax to GDP ratios for low-income countries and low and middle-income countries in red, and the gray lines are just showing all low-income countries. The picture here is one of slow growth in tax GDP in the early 2000s and then relative stagnation since 2010. In the graph on the right, I have the average year-on-year change in the tax GDP ratio for all low-income countries and low and middle-income countries. And from 1990 to 2020, on average across both groups, countries saw an increase of 0.1 percentage points in tax GDP each year. There's only one low-income country that has actually increased their tax GDP by at least 9 percentage points in the last 20 years, and that was Mozambique in the context of natural resource exploitation. A handful of countries have seen up to 5 percentage points increases, but these also take a lot of time. So we have examples from Togo, which took 12 years to raise 5 extra percentage points, 8 years in Rwanda and Malawi, and 6 years in the DRC. It's this long, slow process, is the main conclusion. And now I'll hand to Max for the next 2 parts of the presentation.
Thank you very much. So I think what the last 2 graphs that Adrienne showed really highlight is that in light of kind of the last 2 decades, many of the common targets that are floating around tax to GDP ratios in particular have been very ambitious. And arguably, targets shouldn't be very ambitious. They should be equal in ambition to the monumental and important task of building tax capacity. ambitious targets can signal commitment, can signal opportunity, and can give us a sense of what's possible. But one of the impetus behind the policy brief that we wrote was that, based on the conversations that we had with colleagues and partners and researchers, was that there are also real risks to overly ambitious targets. One of them is that they can incentivize short-termism. If targets are overly ambitious, and if missing them has consequences for the people involved, they can incentivize policymakers and tax administrators to pursue measures that help meet them in the short term, but undermine developing tax capacity in the longer term. If we look at some of the higher spikes in tax-to-GDP ratios that AD had discussed, and some of which are in the paper, these are often not maintained. So this can incentivize short-termist policies, or policies that shift burdens to lower income groups or groups with already high tax burdens. They might also incentivize misreporting, and we have a couple of examples of that in the brief as well. The key point of note here is that they can't just incentivize misreporting with respect to the tax side, but also obviously with respect to GDP itself. They can undermine social contracts. A substantial increase in tax collection, especially these very large numbers of percentage points that we're talking about here, reflect a fundamental modification of social contracts. So they're a part of a wider conversation between states and citizens, and they raise expectations in terms of service provision, transparency, and accountability. Many citizens, enough surveys tell us, already feel that they're not getting enough of that. So I think increasing taxes in a way that is not in line with other reforms, that is misaligned with other reforms, really risks undermining kind of public support for tax reform. And finally, there's a risk that very ambitious targets or very ambitious projections overstate the role that tax can play in financing development. That it goes from highlighting the true fact that tax can play an essential role to the idea that it can do the whole job, that it can serve as a way to pretend that important other conversations, especially around aid and around the conditions of debt, are not needed. So where do we go from here? So despite these challenges, and if you could go to the next slide, there's clearly an important function for targets in tax policy and administration. They help us track progress, they help us set expectations, and identify potential for reform priorities. So what we really want to do with this conversation today is to start a dialogue about how to get targets right, how to make targets better. One of the most obvious lessons is that targets should emerge out of experience and detailed know-how of how tax administration and tax policy processes work in the countries that we talk about, which explains the makeup of this panel and hopefully the wider conversation that we'll have. But beyond that, we have 5 recommendations that we think might be useful starting points for discussion. The first is that we should set tax-to-GDP targets when we use them realistically. That's partly because they're methodologically challenged, and I think Kyle will say more about that, but also because tax-to-GDP targets usually lack time, especially if we think of them as pure kind of tax gap estimates or questions about potential. And I think making them time-dependent really highlighted what AD presented above, and what kind of the global context has shown us over the last couple of decades is that even a relatively small, sustained increase is really quite ambitious. Speaking of sustained, the second point that we highlight is that we would really prioritize sustainable revenue goals. So again and again, we see that improvements are not maintained over time. And that aside from improving itself, avoiding the erasure of improvements may be just as important at building tax capacity. So we suggest emphasizing sustainability as a key aspect of how we track tax targets. For example, by considering an increase only as achieved if it has been sustained over multiple years, to encourage governments to prioritize reforms that yield sustainable revenue gains over time as opposed to quick wins. We also suggest that we should incorporate reform sequencing and timelines more explicitly. Improving tax administration and building tax capacity does not generate linear improvements. A well-sequenced reform agenda acknowledges that revenue gains from different kinds of measures have different timelines. Introducing VAT or adopting electronic billing machines can usually result in immediate gains, but these cannot be repeated by just reintroducing the same measure again and again. Building on them, expanding them, might have a fundamentally different timeline in terms of the payoffs and its individual introduction. So better targets should take reform sequencing into account, ideally connecting them with things such as medium-term revenue strategies quite explicitly, setting timeframes in which revenue gains can be realistically achieved. Fourth, we highlight that it might be worth to diversify the criteria that we use to assess the performance of tax administrations. While they might be intuitive and widely used, there are clear practical limits to the tax-to-GDP ratio targets. The African Tax Administration, TADAT, are already moving into this direction, creating process targets in addition to narrower revenue targets. And I imagine that Modeste will say more about this in a minute. Finally, adjusting tax targets to political contexts is almost a parallel point to the point above about reform sequencing. It's about taking into account the fact that tax sits within wider reform agendas and wider budget cycles, and adjusting to them explicitly. Now, all of these are some suggestions from our end. They're not a prescriptive list, but what we were hoping is that they're a good part of a start of a wider conversation, which might see this list shrinking or expanding further on, as well as hopefully a wider research agenda that connects this more explicitly with the practical experiences of building tax capacity in lower and middle income countries around the world. So without much further ado, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I will pass back on to Giulia.
Thank you very much, Adi and Max, for this great presentation. I think it's clear from some of the data that you have presented that tax, yes, is the major source of development financing, but at the same time, it is in itself not enough, and the financing gap is still huge and potentially widening as a result of debt servicing and so on. So regardless of how we think about targets, I think we can all agree that there is a big financing gap and there is a huge need to increase revenue. So it is a matter of how we do that, and not only how much more revenue can we raise, and also what is the relevant time scale. So that point about time and the risk by not keeping a close eye on the how we increase revenue and in what timeline is exactly the kind of unintended consequences that you highlighted just now in the presentation. So I'd like to pass on to Baimwera now, and with a specific question for you. So we've just heard this presentation about these unintended consequences of tax targets if they focus too much on ambitious, overly ambitious, and perhaps unrealistic revenue increases. So I wonder if, in your experience in Kenya at KESRA and the KRA, do you recognize some of those unintended consequences? Do they resonate with you? But not only the unintended consequences, also the ways to make better targets that Max mentioned, particularly at the end. I'm passing over to you, and I look forward to hearing your experience from Kenya.
Thank you very much, Giulia. And I think I can't agree more on the issue of unintended consequences of tax-to-GDP targets. But even more important, let me say this, that first of all, there's no doubt that the tax capacity for many low income and low income countries is actually higher than they have been able to do that, to collect. Putting into perspective Kenya, I believe that as at this point in time, our ability to collect revenue is possibly higher than we have been able to accrue. And I say that the target are for us because, first of all, without proper revenue targets, we may not generate sufficient funds to cover government expenditure. We may also not be able to put our efforts as a tax administrators in that direction, and also our efforts in a way in which we can be able to generate these sufficient revenues. The importance of the targets cannot be understated because for all the years we have had targets. But let me say that we have a challenge with the way in which we target. For example, I can give you that in the last almost 14 years, Kenya or KRA was first of all able to meet its target revenue in 2022. And then again, 2023, we missed. So it shows the challenge of target setting. as to whether the 9% target is reasonable, that is also something that is quite questionable, because I see from our example, for the last 5 years, we have not only as the tax to GDP ratio for Kenya decreased from almost 18 to almost down to 14%, but also we have been elusive even in our GDP growth, and possibly in 2020, which can be attributed to COVID. So this debate to me is quite ripe, because are our targets developed in the right way? Are our targets set in a way in which they can be achieved? Because one of the challenges we have is demotivating the tax administrators. For example, when targets are set in a way we cannot be able to achieve them in, say, 10 or 14 years, then it becomes a routine that possibly the administrators find quite demotivating. Even more important, what do we take into consideration in setting this target? Ideally, target setting should be a consultative approach, roping in the stakeholders like the Treasury, tax administrators who are going to implement the set revenue targets, and even more important, because you see the political goodwill that is required for a tax administration to effectively meet these particular targets is quite huge, or is very important. I noticed that not only in Kenya, but other East African countries have had challenges in meeting these their own targets. For instance, Uganda, Tanzania, our East African counterparts. So the issue here is how we set the targets, and more important, how we plan to achieve them. The efforts, the methodologies, the implementation mechanism that is going to see us achieve this particular target. For policymakers, for instance, when we sit down to set national revenue targets as per our national tax policy, what do we put into account? Well, we have maintained almost an upward growth in GDP. We noticed that the tax to GDP ratio has been highly subdued. So the important thing is that the targets must be set as realistically as possible, and even more important, roping in the tax administrators, because the many type of strategies that Kenya Revenue Authority has put in place to achieve these targets, ranging from employment of technology, including effective risk management, like Max mentioned, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, data-driven analysis, and even broadening our tax base, have also not been able to help us achieve these targets. And therefore, the question remains, how and in what ways do we achieve targets? Even the political goodwill that is required for the last 3 administrations that we have had in Kenya, for instance, from Mwai Kibaki, President Uhuru Kenyatta, and currently President William Ruto, we have had sufficient political goodwill to enable us carry out the required reforms for tax administrations, so that we can be able to collect more to fund government activities. And still, the targets that have been set by the National Treasury for the tax administration regime in elusive. So what I would advocate for is a synergistic approach of setting realistic targets, roping in politicians, and especially we know the high net worth individuals mostly sit in political spaces, who in some way frustrate the revenue collection efforts, like we've seen. Some of the targets under that category have not been achieved, while still broadening the tax base. In many East African countries, for instance, what we find is a highly informal economy, such that choreographing the tax effort in a way to come up with the targets that can be reasonably achieved is also a challenge, because quantifying the economic effect, the ability of these businesses that are quite stochastic in terms of their business activities makes it a little bit difficult to eventually come up with a good tax target from that direction. So what have we been doing to try and get more revenues, accrue more tax revenues for the country? We've been trying to formalize this informal sector in a way in which we have put significant efforts, not only in technology, but also in the business structures of these informal businesses, especially in form of SMEs, so that more can be accrued from that particular bracket. As I conclude, let me say this. The targets that any country should set should take into account the structure, the capability, and the organization of the tax administrators to achieve them. Because the operational aspect of collecting revenue is charged with the tax administrators, who should be able to understand and be informed and be included in setting targets in the direction in which, from a practical perspective, they can be able to see, yes, we can be able to make accrue more revenue from that. The second one is that the political will, which is lacking in most of the lower income countries or LIDCs, is very critical to mobilizing revenue for the government and eventually meeting those targets. And like I said before, it is the high net worth individuals sitting in this species sometimes who frustrate the efforts for the revenue administrators to accrue more revenue for the country. So targets are important, targets are good, and targets are necessary to ensure that we move in a direction in which we can be able to collect more revenue. As whether we can be able to achieve the 9% as envisaged by IMF, that is another story. Our efforts in Kenya shows that not only has our tax to GDP decreased, even in instances where it has increased, we have not been able to garner more than 0.5%. And this is a similar story to the rest of the African countries. So the question is, should we continue setting these targets that not only demotivate the tax administrators, but also do not get to a point where they can be achieved?
Yes.
10, 15 years.
Thank
countries
you.
Within the same level. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks. I think you captured really well the crux of the issue here, which is that obviously targets are needed. They can guide and motivate those huge revenue increases that are no doubt needed, but at the same time, they can be counterproductive if they're elusive. But also the fact that countries like Kenya don't necessarily meet those targets doesn't mean that there isn't progress. So I really appreciate that you have, in fact, given quite a few examples of the measures and things that KRA, like many other revenue authorities on the continent, is considering to increase tax, to improve tax administration, to capture high net worth individuals, and so on. So there's definitely a lot going on, and we shouldn't lose sight of the huge progress that's been made, despite the target perhaps being missed or not achieved to the extent that one might want. I would like to move to Doris now. And in doing that, Doris, I'd like to abstract a little bit from whether 9% is realistic or not, because for me, there is a fundamental question here that regardless of whether it is 9% or 3 percentage points or 15 percentage points, there is an IMF paper that I really enjoyed saying that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, lower income countries should double their tax capacity, which actually means 15 percentage points more, because that is the size of the financing gap. So I think we can all agree, regardless of how we compute the targets, that the scale of the challenge is huge and the scale of the increase is huge. So I'd like to hear your thoughts a bit on how realistic is to achieve those large increases, whether it's 9% or a different number, within the next 6 years, because we're looking at 2030 for the Sustainable Development Goals, and perhaps your reflections about what kinds of targets are most useful to support Commissioner Generals in lower income countries who are committed to not only increasing revenue, but doing it in a way that is equitable, efficient, and sustainable. And of course, I'm hoping that you can bring in your experience as a senior economist at the IMF, but also as a previous Commissioner General.
Thank you very much, Giulia. And I want to express my appreciation for being on this panel or to discuss very important conversations about tax targeting. First, from the outset, I would like to just put into context the IMF paper that you have mentioned relating to the 9%. And we will not focus too much on the 9%, but I just wanted to put some context to it, that tax targeting and improving tax capacity in low income countries is a function of the tax system, and what component of improving tax capacity comes from, say, tax system design, and what component comes from improved revenue administration. So I think the compilation of the 9% has a breakdown on components that come from tax system design. How do we, for example, rationalize tax expenditures, and how do we then improve revenue administration, and what components of that form part of the 9%? I think for those who are able to read the paper, you'll be able to see the breakdown. But having said that, the tax targeting, and like my counterpart has said, I mean, a predecessor has said, the previous speaker has said that it is an important element of improving tax capacity. It is a good way to measure the tax potential of a particular tax system. And you will note that I'm not only referring to revenue administration. My emphasis is on tax system. It's important for a country that is committed to not only strengthening their tax capacity, but also stretching their potential to meet, to cover the taxing gap, to understand where is the potential and how can this potential be perhaps realized. And so tax targeting is one such way to do it. Our focus on the tax-to-GDP ratio is a metric that is commonly understood and that can be applied across the board. And that is why there is a lot of emphasis on increasing tax-to-GDP ratios if countries are supposed to or are expecting to improve their tax take to realize the Sustainable Development Goals. Quantifying growth in the tax target is where perhaps the revenue administrations take interest, because any increases in the tax-to-GDP ratio is communicated to a revenue administration in form of a revenue target that they need to collect. The process around quantifying this increase is where we need to have the conversations, and I think this conversation, like Bernard has mentioned, needs to bring in both the revenue administration, tax policy, and also other people that are involved in the fundamentals of the economy. When a revenue target is decided, it is usually, or it should be, based on certain assumptions of the fundamentals in the economy. Are those fundamentals, are those assumptions correct? If those assumptions are correct, then the revenue target is assumed that it will be realistic and should then be collected. Every year, there would be some organic growth in GDP. How is that growth then measured so that it is reflected in the revenue target for the tax administration. And this is the process that perhaps needs to be emphasized, to be inclusive, to be consultative, but also to be properly grounded on the fundamentals. The second thing about revenue targeting is that it is good for tax targets to have some element of stretch, some elements of stretch, especially for the revenue administration, to avoid complacency, but also to incentivize innovations, to incentivize methods, better methods of work, and how other reforms can be put in place in order for those figures to be realized. And therefore, that stretch in the revenue target that then potentially leads to a growth in the tax to GDP ratio is a good thing for revenue administrations. I would like to come back to the component that tax to GDP ratios is a ratio, and it's a comparator between tax take and GDP, and the GDP, call it the GDP size. So there has been a lot of focus on revenue administrations bringing in the increase to the tax to GDP ratio. I would like to suggest that there has to be also another focus on how do we translate GDP growth into tax revenue? What kind of tax policy system design needs to be put in place to translate GDP growth into revenue potential? And here, for example, I'll give examples of countries that have a huge dependence, for example, on agriculture as a huge component of their GDP. What component of those large sizes of the GDP are actually contributing to revenue? And I think that's a very healthy conversation that you need to have between tax policy, revenue administration on increases to the tax to GDP ratio. What components of your GDP is actually not being taxed? What components of your GDP are you giving away in form of tax expenditures? And if you need to see a growth in tax to GDP ratio, it's important not only to look at revenue collection, but how do we then increase the tax take from growth in GDP? And I think this is when I would like to use that when targets are getting targets right. The focus, the principal focus on revenue administrations increasing tax to GDP ratios, I think is just one limb of the table of the stool. We need also to look at tax system design. How do we get the GDP growth to be reflected in tax potential? Just to come back to the unintended consequences, it is true that when tax targets are not done right, there would be some unintended consequences. And here I would like to look at one of the, call it, issues that are commonly dealing with rebasing of GDP. The rebasing of GDP that happens frequently is really to put a correct size to what the GDP is like after periodic interventions of reforms. But that rebasing of GDP will always have a reduction in the tax to GDP ratio because GDP is growing. What does that communicate? It communicates that the revenue administration is not doing its part, is not pulling its weight, which is not true. Because if the rebasing of the GDP was also done to reflect what the last tax take before the rebasing was, you'd see a commensurate growth in tax revenue. But this is a conversation that is not usually done. It's usually done on one side, but doesn't reflect the tax, the contribution of the tax revenue or the tax administration. And this, like you rightly pointed out in the policy brief, leads to disillusionment, but also communicates that perhaps revenue administrations need only to focus on tax to GDP ratios. It's important for our revenue administration, our commissioners general, to look at other components of tax productivity, particularly from the revenue administration side. The tax administration has to show its effectiveness and its efficiency in creating an increased collections from growth in GDP. And therefore, you need to look at year-on-year growth. You need to look at how are you improving your core tax processes, how are you improving on segmentation, and bringing in revenue from taxpayers that should be paying and are not paying. But a focus on tax to GDP will always perhaps lead to some of those unintended consequences that have been mentioned in the paper. I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris, for sharing your experience and for being willing to share some of those unintended consequences of focusing on the tax to GDP ratio, including GDP rebasing. But I also liked very much your points about needing to think about tax system design in a holistic way and how to translate growth into tax revenue in a way that is not necessarily only focused on the tax to GDP as one metric. But still, I took your point that, still measuring those increases and those efforts does require some target, and the tax to GDP remains an important metric. And it has the huge advantage of being comparative across countries, which of course many other metrics cannot do. And I think that gives me a very good link to pass on now to Kyle. As I do that, I would also like to encourage everyone to please post your comments and questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A box, which should be available to you on Zoom. And Kyle, over to you. I wanted to ask you about this tax to GDP ratio and tax targets based on the tax to GDP ratio. I know you've got lots of experience and you've been doing quite a lot of thinking around these issues, and particularly the methodologies behind those tax targets based on the tax ratio. So I was wondering if you can distill for us a bit of the key methodological considerations and in simple words for a wide audience as we have today, and maybe some of the reflections on how to improve those targets. So I'll pass over to you now. You have about 7 minutes like the other speakers.
Great. Thank you, Giulia, and thanks for the invitation to give my humble perspectives on this massive topic today. So I want to try and speak to where my experiences kind of like intersect with this discussion. And like as you mentioned, I have a background in research, and I've a couple of years ago co-authored a paper that attempts to estimate tax effort in a similar vein to the IMF study that has been part of the genesis for the discussion today. But more recently, as part of the Tax Dev program, I've had the immense privilege to work pretty closely with policymakers, primarily in Uganda over the past 5 years, but also in some neighboring countries. So let me first focus on giving a few reflections on the methodological issues of estimating tax effort before talking from the perspective of someone who actually engages with policymakers on a donor-funded TA program and talking about what we can do with those estimates that we see from those studies. So about the methodological issues, we're talking today about an estimate of tax effort that suggests that many low-income developing countries could, on average, be collecting 9 percentage points of GDP more than they currently are. And I think, as the brief makes fairly clear, it's going to be very difficult for many, if not any, LIDC to get there anytime soon. The average low-income developing country, according to this study, is collecting at around 2/3 of their potential, around zero, or about a tax effort score of about 67%. But let's remember that this average score of 67% masks the fact that many countries will be performing above that average. And unfortunately, in the most recent study we've seen from the fund, we haven't seen any country-by-country estimates, which is a real shame. And I hope the authors do release those at some point, because it would be really good to understand which countries are actually performing at which rates and where have there been perhaps success stories recently. We also don't see any discussion of how the rates have evolved over time. And while some of that might be due to the estimation procedure employed not allowing for that to happen or for that to be exported, if a given country has a tax effort at the average of 67%, but a decade ago had a tax effort of 57%, that's actually a success story. And that would be really interesting to unpack that and to get a deeper understanding of the dynamics of that performance over time. So this kind of long history of estimating tax effort is based on a set of models that essentially tell us or ask the question, given a country's prevailing economic structure and other conditions. So how far away is its tax ratio from a hypothetical frontier amount of tax it could be collecting. And those conditions or inputs that go into the model will be things like the rate, the level of GDP per capita, some measure of the economic structure, the share of agriculture in GDP, and some indicators that try to capture the governance environment in a given country. But importantly, none of these models, and I include the study that I worked on in what I'm saying, none of these models do a particularly good job at actually controlling for the underlying tax policy or tax administration environment across countries. That's largely because we don't have really good, reliable, comprehensive cross-country data that can accurately capture those things. But that's a major shortcoming of the models. And so tax effort modeling does a fairly good job at approximating the size and the shape of a country's tax base, but a much less good job at approximating the level of tax capacity. That's how much tax you can efficiently collect from that base. And so the output of these exercises, or the model tax gap or tax effort score, is then explained by policy and administrative inefficiencies in a given country. But as has already been mentioned, tax effort studies don't really tell us where those inefficiencies lie or what to do about them and how quickly they can be addressed. So if I think about this discussion from the perspective of someone who works on a TA program with tax policymakers, like, well, what do I do with this headline figure? Or what does a finance minister do with the information that their tax system is collecting 9% of GDP less than a model could be? Should that become the target for where revenue collection can get to, and over what time frame? I think we'd all agree that possibly it shouldn't. But I also don't know that it matters whether that number is 9 or 12 or 15% more. It's an astronomically large amount in any low-income developing country. But I'm fairly sure that everyone participating here would agree with the statement that every low-income developing country would like to increase its tax ratio, and all of them are working really hard to do so. But as the brief mentioned from ICG, there are very few magic bullets to be found here. You can't introduce the VAT every year. You get one shot to do that, and you might get a revenue bump from that. But those big reforms, there are not so many of them. And to credit the IMF paper, which was sort of background for this discussion, it is fairly rich in sensible ideas for strengthening the tax system over the long run. Things like governance arrangements, establishing a tax policy department within the Ministry of Finance, strengthening the forecasting function, or the development of medium-term revenue strategies. And those are all very sensible ideas. But I wanted to sort of finish off by talking about something that I sort of worry in the face of these headlines or overly ambitious targets, about the temptation to immediately pursue policy rather than administrative reforms. An increase in tax rates or an introduction of a new tax can sometimes be a really salient reform versus or vis-a-vis more long-term efforts to expand the tax base or increase compliance that might involve a lot of back-end investment in IT, which you don't see and doesn't make the headlines. But we do know from a lot of tax gap analysis that quite often the majority of a tax gap does lie on the administration and not the policy side. It's not the case that most low-income developing countries have really low tax rates. In fact, in many countries, it's the opposite. And so the brief does make reference to the temptation of raising taxes or introducing taxes in the short run that might negatively impact upon poverty or inequality, for example. And in the absence of well-designed cash transfer systems that could compensate for higher tax burdens on low-income countries, you might end up with a fiscal system that negatively affects poverty or inequality if new taxes are introduced or existing ones are raised. And that's, an outcome that we would probably all like to avoid. So ultimately, as everyone will recognize, the key priority of the finance minister or the permanent secretary or the CG is to fund next year's budget, and that means revenue. But a carefully sequenced reform agenda, like, for example, a medium-term revenue strategy that's backed up by good research and analysis, can actually work to minimize negative effects of reform that do seek to increase revenue. So I'll pass back to Giulia from there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kyle. Another really insightful reflection for you. And I think I particularly like your point that the gap is really a lot to do with tax administration and yes, with tax policy, but maybe that's not the main gap where the main gap lies. And I think that leads us very neatly onto Amina, and particularly, this idea of making sure that tax gap analysis and targets are really very well embedded into the context, into the tax administration, what the tax administration is already doing. And this is, in fact, a point that came up in both Bernard's and Doris's remarks. So, Amina, you've been, of course, engaged in this debate quite a lot, and you've been thinking about how to do tax gaps differently. And I'd like to hear a bit more from you about that, and what different perspective does that different methodology bring to the debate?
Thanks, Giulia and ictd for organizing this really important discussion. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about our experience then in this space, and thanks to Giulia for really challenging me to think a little bit more broadly about how this then affects tax targets. So UNU-WIDER has done some work with revenue authorities in Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Zambia, and South Africa. And part of this work has been to estimate the tax gap. And a lot of our work is collaborative. And this is a question that came from the revenue authority to us and said, well, this is something that we are curious about. There's something that we need to know, something we need to understand. And so the approach that we've taken is actually to look at bottom-up estimation of the tax gap, which involves using tax microdata. And this differs from the very well-known top-down approach, which employs macro data. I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes, but this is an important point to start on. So the tax gap is really this difference between the tax potential and the tax collection. And this kind of difference gives us this measure of compliance at the revenue authority. And this is different from the policy gap. So like the segue from Kyle. And this is something that is important to understand what can actually be gained from within the tax base that revenue authorities already have. And what are the ways to improve tax collection? So really like a compliance discussion. So in our work, we've estimated the tax gap in Zambia to be around 50%, and then even higher in Tanzania. So when I announce this number, I often get asked, well, so how does this compare to, to Kenya, or how does this compare to Ethiopia, or how does this how do I think about this? And one of the important things that I want to stress is actually that's not really directly comparable. So unlike maybe the tax-to-GDP ratios, tax gap estimates actually are quite dependent on the tax system or the construction of the tax system and the culture of paying taxes and the reliance and ability of your tax administration. The other important point that I want to make is that that exact numbers actually not so important, but actually what happens over time. And I think this point was raised quite nicely earlier as well, that it doesn't tell us, what's been going on. Like, has it actually improved? Has the tax gap increased? Has it decreased? Like, this just gives us kind of snapshot. The flip side of that, of course, is that revenue authorities need to be able to do this calculation regularly in order to actually see what that trend looks like. So this is something that's quite important, and we haven't seen so much of this regularization of tax gap estimations in revenue authorities. So I'd say that we enter this work with a view on compliance, and really it is, after all, this calculation of like the tax compliance gap. And I think what's interesting about the work that we've been able to do so far is to think about drilling down into this tax gap and understanding where it's coming from. And so you can do this looking at industry, looking at the tax gap within an industry. You can look at the small firms, medium firms, your large firms. You can look at breaking it down with, depending on different declaration amounts. And really the point is, and I guess what's relevant and why this is so context specific, is that you're looking at ways to improve compliance. So, for example, the VAT gap is really high in Zambia in the mining sector. And so something that we then, want to think about, and then the revenue authority says, okay, well, why is this the case? What are the issues there, and what are the things that need to be unpacked there? So it's really just kind of drilling down. That's really important. And I think, how this can really be useful, and then to kind of bring this back to this discussion on tax targets. So if done well, tax gap estimations can be really useful for compliance risk management. And this is really to think about how to improve the efficiency and outcomes of audits. And this then is based on the capacity and skills to the relevant tax authority. This is really ultimately to then raise revenue efficiently and sustainably. And this is kind of highlights one of the ways that you can actually use data to inform tax policy making. Thanks, Giulia.
Thank you very much, Amina, for these really insightful reflections on your experience with the slightly different perspective and methods for estimating those tax gaps. I would now turn to Modeste, and the question I'd like to ask you is slightly different. We've discussed a lot the tax gap, the methods for measuring it, the tax-to-GDP ratio, but obviously that is not the only metric. And in fact, you as head of TADAT know more than anybody else that there is a range of indicators that in fact have been developed within TADAT to monitor progress in tax administration, which are particularly important in a context where much of the tax gap sits with tax administration as well as tax policy. And interestingly, the tax-to-GDP ratio is in fact not one of the indicators within TADAT. For good reasons, the purpose is quite different. But I'm wondering if you can give us that perspective on a wider set of indicators and targets based on the TADAT experience, and also more specifically, how can they help guide reform? Because this issue has been coming up from some of the previous speakers. The tax-to-GDP ratio might be useful in setting the gap and the extent of the challenge, but then when it comes to actually designing reform, one needs to get at a much more granular level. So does TADAT help with that in your experience, both as a head of TADAT, but also, of course, as previous Director General of the Cameroonian Tax Administration? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Giulia. Well, setting quantitative targets for revenue collection has been, from my experience, always a source of tension between stakeholders. But it remains unavoidable and even useful and can be successful when proper conditions are put in place. So why do I say it has always been a source of tension among the stakeholders? From my experience, the tension arises among key players in the preparation of the state budget within the Ministries of Finance and Economy, namely the directorates in charge of budget, economy, treasury, and of course, taxation. They usually have divergent interests regarding budget targets. The Director General of Economy is generally inclined to show a flattering economic growth rate for multiple reasons, which direct consequence is to raise or increase the level of revenue expected from the tax administration. The Director General of Treasury will also be happy with a prospect of more revenue coming in to better manage the pressure of payments arising from inflation in public spendings like salaries, public services, infrastructure, and debt service. The Director General of Budget is also fine with having more budgetary space, but he hopes to reduce the budget deficit. Plus, he hopes to reduce the budget deficit. So all this means more revenue. Then comes the Director General of Taxes, who would usually try to lower the expectations of his colleagues because he knows collecting taxes is not an easy task. but his colleagues will generally find him too much conservative. And the arbitration usually requested from the Minister of Finance never goes in favor of the tax administration because the spendings often dictate the level of resources expected from the tax administration, complemented with debt. Another source of tension is the tendency to mechanically apply the economy's growth rate to tax revenues. Doris insisted on it, even though the two have different structures, the economy and the tax system. We can also add the evaluation of the impact of tax policy reforms or measures to improve tax administration. All these issues are often a source of tension between the players involved. But is it a bad thing to set quantitative resource mobilization targets? First and foremost, it's worth pointing out that we don't think that the IMF staff discussion note used as a pretext for the policy brief was advocating overly ambitious quantitative targets for tax authorities. Rather, it seems to us that based on a gap analysis, the authors identified a potential to mobilize internal resources in low-income developing countries that ultimately represents an aspiration over the long term. With this precision, the question is, are quantitative targets harmful? A priori, as highlighted in the policy brief of the ICTD on getting targets right, some issues might arise from setting overly ambitious quantitative targets to tax authorities in low-income developing countries. As noted in the paper, in practice, this can be a source of bad policy and administration. I have a recollection of audit process geared towards revenue generation and not improving compliance, which is a bad thing. But on a closer examination, there are also many virtues to setting quantitative revenue targets, such as the development of a culture of performance and results-based management, which are still quite rare in public administrations, particularly those of the low-income developing countries. It is in this sense that you will find in most countries that tax administrations, because of this pressure to deliver results, are innovating more. They are, for instance, in the forefront of digitization in most of the countries. In fact, I think everyone agrees that there should be targets, both to set the course and to track achievements, and that the debate is on the level of ambition to be displayed. To answer the question of how much should be the target, in other terms, what should be the ambition level, I think we need to answer two other questions. Is the potential there? Number one. Number two, under what conditions can we transform this potential? Is the potential there? I would say yes, from the point of view of TADAT, as you asked me, Giulia. TADAT is a diagnostic tool that has been used successfully for 10 years now for evaluating the performance of tax administration systems. This tool assesses the performance of a tax administration system against a set of good international practices grouped in 9 performance outcome areas. As of today, 135 national TADAT assessments were carried out in 107 countries, including 36 low-income developing countries. So what do the TADAT results say about tax administrations in low-income developing countries? The TADAT results suggest there is a very strong potential for improving revenue performance in low-income developing countries. From a TADAT perspective, low-income developing countries lag in some cases significantly on key characteristics of effective revenue administrations compared to emerging market economies and advanced economies. For instance, in advanced economies, the average compliance rate with good practices as displayed in TADAT is 41%, and the absence of good practice represents only 17%. In emerging market economies, the average compliance rate with good practices in tax administration is 24%, and absence of good practice is 38%. And in low-income developing countries, the average compliance rate with good practices is only 15%, and the absence of good practices is 50%. So the key areas of weaknesses in low-income developing countries resulting from TADAT assessments are as follows: the problem of data integrity and even unavailability of critical data, the lack of a systematic risk management approach in managing compliance, as just said, the poor focus on turnaround times when providing services to taxpayers, the poor on-time filing and payment ratios, the inadequate debt management processes, which raises question about the quality of the audits themselves and capabilities of tax administration to collect outstanding tax arrears. Also, the inefficient revenue management processes, like not refunding or refunding out of time VAT credits, and this has a lot of consequence on tax morale. The weak monitoring of public confidence in tax administration and the relying too much on withholding for tax collections. So these shortcomings reveal key deficiencies in two essential areas of tax administration: capabilities, which is often decisive for enforcement, and public confidence or trust, which is decisive for compliance. So if the potential exists, under what condition can we transform this potential? I think that is the question. And the ICTD policy brief highlights time as the most important resource. From a TADAT perspective, based on the weaknesses arising from the diagnostic of low-income developing countries' tax systems, several things should be emphasized in the post-TADAT reform agenda: addressing trust issues. This is number one. And what do we intend by addressing trust issues? It's more about enhancing the social contract to improve tax morale, especially by improving the state collective and individual services and protection to their people. The quality of spending and social protection are key. And for that, I think also we should add, we need political will and commitment to do so, and taking, of course, a medium-term approach that links revenue reforms to government priorities, as just mentioned. The second point is addressing capabilities issues. By investing, and I think we don't stress this enough, by investing in the revenue administration, it is important that it is key to increase revenues. And what I mean by investing in the revenue administration is human investment and technological investment. They are key. So under these conditions, authorities can set more ambitious targets for tax revenue collection, because in the end, it's a matter that regards the authorities themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Modeste. Again, really insightful reflections there. And I think you're absolutely right that at least the way I've heard part of your remarks is the point is not so much should we have targets or should we not have them. The point is, what level of ambition do we want to have and what is the potential? And of course, TADAT gives us very, very precise indications about that potential and what needs to be done to tap it, but also how can it be quantified in terms of where the revenue administration is at. So that was really interesting. You also mentioned some unintended consequences, and that starts to answer some of the questions that I'm seeing popping up in the Q&A. The first question that we had received there is about, is there any empirical evidence from the experiences of lower income countries with unrealistic tax-to-GDP targets hindering tax collection? And I think you said something that struck me, Modeste, which is, one of the unintended consequences might be to increase revenue rather than increase compliance. So I think that is already in itself quite a nice answer to that question, but I'm going to also ask this question back to the panelists, and I'm going to give you a chance to comment further on that. You've also mentioned on the culture of performance and achieving ambitious targets. And again, we have one question in the chat about that tension between the Ministry of Finance and the Revenue Administration. I'm not going to be, I'm going to open the Q&A with actually an apologies to everybody who has posted those questions. I'm not going to be able to go through each one of the questions or get the perspectives of all panelists on all those questions, because we really only have just over 15 minutes to wrap up the conversation. But I'm going to try to group them and then go back to all our panelists to reflect on those issues as we close. So the question about the slight tension between the Ministries of Finance and the Revenue Authority comes from Damakrin. She's saying that, of course, government expenditure has a huge impact on target setting, and targets are sometimes raised without the consultation of tax administrations. So how can tax administrations play a role in expenditure, and has there any country that has achieved that? So I wonder if maybe Doris or Modeste want to speak to that issue. But it's also related to a separate question, which is about incentives on the level of ambition, to use your language, Modeste. And of course, there is a point that Doris made earlier about the need to get tax administrations to be stretched a bit, because that is where the incentives for performing and for achieving comes from. But at the same time, as Mick is saying in the chat, there is a strong vested interest in keeping those targets quite low, because the staff remuneration of revenue administrators depends heavily on bonuses that they can expect and they can receive from achieving the annual collection target. So there is a bit of a tension there between setting a high level of ambition, but also resistance to doing that in relation to actually wanting to achieve those targets and also the benefits that come with it. There are then a number of questions that I was going to direct to Kyle and Amina, but again, everybody please feel free to speak to those questions as you wish, that have to do with the tax mix. So Zorka Milin is saying, beyond tax-to-GDP targets, do you have any thoughts on what should be the optimal share of corporate taxes as a share of total tax revenues? And this is particularly important for lower income countries because they are more dependent on corporate taxes. I think we have mentioned a bit in the discussion about this tax policy and tax administration difference in thinking about the tax gap. So I think that's related to that. And then again, on the tax mix, there is another question about whether the focus should be on increasing tax rates on specific taxes or improving revenue administration and efficiency, which again speaks to the broader point of whether there is more potential in tax policy or tax administration to close that gap. And the answer is probably a bit of both, but I'd like your reflections on that. Finally, another question is again related to the tax mix, and it's about lower income countries being more reliant on inherently regressive taxes, and should they shift to more progressive taxes without adding new ones to boost revenue and economic equality. There are probably, I can see one final question again on the broader theme of tensions between the policymakers and tax administration from Henry Saka towards the end. And yes, that formulating targets, the tension can arise from the failure to account for the laxity of taxes that are targeted, and take into account the lead time required to see results. So there's various themes there. I don't think we can necessarily exhaust any of them, but there is something to do with the tax mix and tax policy versus tax administration. There is something around unpacking the unintended consequences. And then there is another cluster of questions around incentives for the level of ambition. And I think a fourth one around inter-institutional relations, and particularly ministries of finance and revenue authorities as the key players in this target setting exercise. I would be quite happy for you to decide which one to focus on, to all our panelists. I don't think you will be able to answer all of them, so please do pick one. And I think we're going to treat this as the final round, so I'm going to give you a bit more than the 2 minutes I had originally promised. So please pick one of the questions, also add your final reflections to it. And I would probably go in the same order, so starting again from you, Bernard, and then moving on to Doris, Kyle, Amina, and Modeste.
Thank you very much. I think I can take one that I've seen directed to me, that the potential role of tax areas in determining tax revenues in low-income developing countries. I think the point here is that if a tax administration hovers into areas, then there could be some possibly 2 or 3 types of problems. Number one, that could be the inability of the administration to collect what a target has been set for it, possibly because of administrative or other challenges, or it could also point to a problem in the way in that particular tax is assigned. Because if you realize, and I can give an example of Kenya, property taxes, for instance, where the fiscal canvas is even not properly mapped, you notice that the collecting this particular type of a tax is always a challenge. So it is the design of the tax that could also lead to so many areas, as well as levels of compliance in the wider regime. And from a tax administration perspective, I think the biggest issue would be how then can you be able to target more in the same specific tax head while still you are unable to collect that which you targeted before. Therefore, the targets, the revenue targets relating to that particular head could definitely be have to be revised based on possibly what is the main challenge. But since you have said you are not going to give me another chance, this is what I'm going to say as I conclude. The biggest problem that we have in low-income developing countries is beyond the targets. The targets are important, and some of them have challenges, but the biggest problem that we have is the wider philosophy of revenue collection. How is the structure of our collection vis-a-vis the target setting system? And this is informed by higher levels of enforcement as opposed to voluntary compliance, which is the biggest problem, making the cost of revenue collection quite high. And therefore, even sometimes the 2% that is normally given for tax administrations isn't enough to collect the revenue because of the higher levels of enforcement as opposed to the level of voluntary compliance. And for low-income countries, I think, like we said before, a synergy between the treasuries and tax administrations, the inter-institution synergy is critical to ensure that the revenue that is targeted is actually reasonable and can be achieved to avoid the ripple effect that we've seen and that we have heard from the panelists could lead to a wider problem of not meeting the targets and then spiraling into a kind of long-term problem of not meeting targets and going forward having serious economic consequences. Thank you. I submit.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Over to you, Doris, for some answers to the questions and some final reflections.
Thank you. Thank you once again. I do appreciate the questions that have come in, and I think my take on this is that, first of all, on the level of ambition, the level of ambition should be informed by the reform agenda that the country has chosen to take. And this should be based on a short to medium term outlook. What is it that is the ambition for policy? What is the ambition for revenue improvements or revenue efficiencies? And this is what should then determine the targeted growth of revenue on a year-to-year basis. Ideally, this should be stipulated as a percentage of GDP in growth, and then quantified in what is the actual revenue number on a year-to-year basis, of course, taking into account other economic fundamentals in the country. For example, whether it's an election year, if there's any outlier revenues that are expected especially for natural resource-rich countries and things like those. But it's also important to take into account that in any tax gap, there's always a break between a policy gap and a compliance gap. Trying to achieve increments in revenue on compliance using policy instruments may not necessarily give you the result, or trying to achieve bridging the gap from compliance, and yet the solution would be a policy design, would also not achieve the result. So it's important for authorities to understand what is the ambition in a reform mindset for the country, and where should the focus be. The focus on incentives, I think, is also critical, but the incentives for revenue administration should not be based only on perhaps achieving targets. There have to be other performance metrics that need to be factored in for productivity or effectiveness of the revenue administration to be measured properly. So to place targets to create an incentive on achieving targets mainly on bonuses without looking at other elements of productivity, I think is where maybe some other conversations need to be held. Finally, on the elasticity of the outcomes of reforms, I think is also critical in determining the revenue targets, because, for example, investments in certain revenue improvements do not yield results right away. And that's why the importance of focusing on a medium outlook is very critical. You may invest heavily in an IT system, but the outcomes of that investment can only be measured maybe 5 years, 4 years down the line. And therefore, it's important when targeting to keep that in mind, that the lead time or the lag time for realizing results from those investments, or even certain tax policy design, is also important in targeting. So when doing targets, there are a lot of considerations that must be held and kept in context, without only looking at perhaps increases to tax-to-GDP ratios. And that would be my takeaway from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris. Kyle, over to you, and then Amina, you can go right after.
Thanks, Giulia. And I'll be very brief with my responses and final remarks. I think one of the questions was about the tax mix and trying to understand what's the optimal share of corporate taxes as a share of total tax revenues, and asking whether low-income countries were more or less dependent on corporate income taxes. Ultimately, every economy and every country is different, but it can be sometimes insightful to try and benchmark how your country is collecting vis-a-vis neighbors or vis-a-vis other countries. If it stands out that your country's collecting a lot or not much corporate tax revenue compared to others, then that's maybe an area where you could look into. But there's no correct answer as to how much or what the optimal share would be. What we do observe when you look at a sort of long run in the data, though, is as countries graduate and grow from being low to middle to high income, the tax mix does rebalance from a dependence actually more on indirect taxes to more of a 50-50 split between direct and indirect tax, which is what we would typically see in OECD and high income countries. I wanted to pick up on one other question in the chat was asking whether sometimes changes or increases in tax rates can be seen as a blanket for inefficiencies of tax administrations. There can sometimes be a temptation to do that. I think my sort of message there would be that it's not wise to solve administrative problems with policy reforms. If there are administrative problems, they require reform on the administrative side. But there can be a temptation to do that in the short run as sort of sticking plaster. So in terms of final reflections on the discussion today, I'm very interested to sort of see a lot more research that attempts to better understand the effects on revenue of various policy and administrative reforms, and how they affect tax buoyancy over time. Doris posed the question in her initial remarks about how do we increase the tax take as the economy grows, and to do that you require a buoyant tax system, and ultimately a lot more ex post analysis that tries to understand the results of policy and admin reform and learn from those reforms will be really fruitful going forward, as countries try to increase their tax ratios. Thank you.
So there's a question in the chat about, so what's behind this, the VAT, the large VAT gap in the mining sector. And I think that's exactly what what we're trying to get at, to say, you can use this kind of tax gap research to actually drill down and say, okay, where is the problem? Okay, maybe there's a problem here. Can we start thinking about what's going on there, and how do we deal with that, or how do we start tackling something like this? Rather than this kind of like blanket, we need to improve compliance and stronger enforcement, or whatever the case may be. I think it's really, it's, somebody mentioned this earlier, it's what is the strategies to meet targets, and like where exactly is the potential, and that's really what we'd like to drive. I think two more points from my side. One is I think there needs to be a case-by-case like cost-benefit assessment about how to actually close, or how much to invest even to close that gap, and like what exactly that means. So, are we investing in lots more audits that's really costly, or can we be a bit more efficient about the few audits that we are able to do? Are we actually targeting the right taxpayers? What is the most that we can get within the resources that are available? And then last, I think that the optimal tax gap is, of course, much smaller, but it's never really zero. And this is, critical. I think what's critical is to actually estimate the potential revenue and these different ways and the different rates of enforcement within revenue authorities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amina. Modeste, over to you for your final remarks and any answers you'd like to give to some of the questions.
Yes, on the tension between tax authorities and the Minister of Finance, I think I'll come back again on the TADAT diagnostic. I think the results of the TADAT assessment would be an interesting instrument to prompt the dialogue, not only with the CD providers, but also with the Minister of Finance, because it is important to use these results to address the capabilities issue with the Minister of Finance. It's good to ask for results to tax administration, but it's also, I think it's better to provide them with the means to achieve these results. And among these capabilities issues, among these means, I insist a lot on the human resources, the manpower, because it is important for tax authorities to be able to recruit and keep high quality staff, which is not always the case, because all the issues we're discussing will be turning around this issue of capability. And also, it was mentioned, this issue of progressive tax, which relates to personal income tax. And I think this issue of personal income tax highlights the point I mentioned about tax morale, because the personal income tax is the domain of tax morale. And from the statistics, I think low-income developing countries would raise only 2% on this specific area, whereas it is the most important in advanced economies and emerging economies. And overall, again, I would say the issue of ambition goes beyond the sole tax administration and encompasses the whole public authorities, which is, I think, the sense of the medium revenue term strategy that Doris mentioned. And I think it's really important to highlight this issue of social contract, because the potential is there, but as always with tax matters, the issue is highly political. The capacity of a country to reach that potential is correlated to the level of the social contract. The needs are enormous, and the citizens understand they must be financed preferably by domestic resources. But to transform the needs and the expectation in an ambition shared between authorities and the citizen is the enormous task which needs trust. I took the case of the VAT refund. If you're not able to refund VAT to taxpayers, don't expect them to pay the taxes as you wish. So transparency, accountability, proper communication, and of course, resources are key in the success of tax administration. The citizens feel that if the citizens feel that the tax are serving them collectively in terms of public services, infrastructure, or individually in terms of social coverage, because when you look into the structure of the tax-to-GDP ratio of advanced economy, you will see a huge portion of social security, which is not the case in low-income developing countries. This is a key factor that we have to address if we want to improve the tax morale in low-income developing countries. But therefore, the social contract should be the basis of the ambition. It is not, if it is not strong, faced with this social demand, the authorities will often back down on necessary reforms. They will be unable to exploit the full potential available and will content themselves with quick wins, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. I think that is the perfect way to conclude. And I personally learned really a lot from all of you. There's lots of food for thought for me, for sure. I'm not going to attempt to even summarize key messages, because I think the discussion was so rich that it would be incredibly difficult to do so in 1 minute, which I think is all I can ask you to stay on for more. I'm only going to say that in conclusion that, I mean, it's obvious from the discussion that yes, we do need tax targets. There is no doubt about that. It's the way we set them. And I found it really interesting in this discussion, this tension between the ambition and realism and how to navigate that boundary. And I think in doing that, it's important that we avoid a sense that lower income countries aren't doing enough, because I think the risk of demotivating staff in revenue authorities is real, and there is much progress, and there are lots of things that are going on. So that is a real risk that one needs to watch out for. The second risk that I see in this space is, of course, that filling the SDG financing gap is not only a responsibility of lower income countries, it does remain, especially in the short to medium term, a collective responsibility, and we shouldn't lose sight of the other sources of finance beyond tax, including aid, and of course that is a big issue in itself. The third thing is this discussion about tax administration. And yes, we can set targets to determine the level of ambition and determine the level of the gap and the potential. But ultimately, it's clear to me that the kind of guidance that revenue authorities need to fill the administrative gap is way more detailed than what can come from a high-level tax target, with all its benefits and drawbacks. And of course, all of this needs to be both the agenda on improving tax administration and improving tax policy needs to be very, very firmly connected to broader fiscal policy and the politics of it, because that is the space where revenue administrations move, and the relationship with ministries of finance and policymakers and the expenditure side of the budget remain key in setting those targets, achieving them, and the potential and the roadmap to do so. So thank you very much for sharing your reflections. I found this discussion incredibly rich. Thank you also to Adrienne and Max. I did not come to you at the end because I didn't want to be even more late on our schedule. I know it's a busy week for everyone, so thanks for taking time away from it to join this conversation. There's going to be more going on from the ictd on this topic, so watch this space. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.